The guests left one after another, for night was already come. And when placid darkness encircled them, and they began to breathe with more ease, suddenly Lazarus's image loomed up before each one in formidable radiance, the blue face of a corpse, grave clothes gorgeous and resplendent, a cold look, in the depths of which lay motionless an unknown horror. As though petrified, they were standing far apart, and darkness enveloped them. But in the darkness blazed brighter and brighter the supernatural vision of him who for 3 days had been under the enigmatical sway of death. For 3 days had he been dead. Thrice had the sun risen and set, but he had been dead. Children had played, streams murmured over pebbles, the wayfarer had lifted up hot dust in the highroad, but he had been dead. And now he is again among them, touches them, looks at them, and through the black discs of his pupils, as through darkened glass, stares the unknowable yonder. Part 3. No one was taking care of Lazarus, for no friends nor relatives were left to him, and the great desert which encircled the holy city came near the very threshold of his dwelling. And the desert entered his house, and stretched on his couch like a wife, and extinguished the fires. No one was taking care of Lazarus. One after the other his sisters, Mary and Martha, forsook him. For a long while Martha was loath to abandon him, for she knew not who would feed him and pity him. She wept and prayed. But one night, when the wind was roaming in the desert, and with a hissing sound the cypresses were bending over the roof, she dressed noiselessly and secretly left the house. Lazarus probably heard the door slam. It banged against the side post under the gusts of the desert wind, but he did not rise to go out and to look at her that was abandoning him. All the night long the cypresses hissed over his head and plaintively thumped the door, letting in the cold, greedy desert. Like a leper, he was shunned by everyone, and it was proposed to tie a bell to his neck, as is done with lepers, to warn people against sudden meetings. But someone remarked, growing frightfully pale, that it would be too horrible if by night the moaning of Lazarus's bell were suddenly heard under the windows, and so the project was abandoned. And since he did not take care of himself, he would probably have starved to death, had not the neighbors brought him food in fear of something that they sensed but vaguely. The food was brought to him by children. They were not afraid of Lazarus, nor did they mock him with naive cruelty as children are wont to do with the wretched and miserable. They were indifferent to him, and Lazarus answered them with the same coldness. He had no desire to caress the black little curls and to look into their innocent shining eyes. Given to time and to the desert, his house was crumbling down, and long since had his famishing, lowing goats wandered away to the neighboring pastures. And his bridal garments became threadbare. Ever since that happy day when the musicians played, he had worn them unaware of the difference of the new and the worn. The bright colors grew dull and faded. Vicious dogs and the sharp thorn of the desert turned the tender fabric into rags. By day, when the merciless sun slew all things alive, and even scorpions sought shelter under stones and writhed there in a mad desire to sting, he sat motionless under the sun rays, his blue face and the uncouth, bushy beard lifted up, bathing in the fiery flood. When people still talked to him, he was once asked, "Poor Lazarus, does it please thee to sit thus and to stare at the sun?" And he had answered, "Yes, it does." So strong, it seemed, was the cold of his 3 days' grave, so deep the darkness, that there was no heat on earth to warm Lazarus, nor a splendor that could brighten the darkness of his eyes. That is what came to the mind of those who spoke to Lazarus, and with a sigh they left him. And when the scarlet, flattened globe would lower, Lazarus would set out for the desert and walk straight toward the sun, as though striving to reach it. He always walked straight toward the sun, and those who tried to follow him and to spy upon what he was doing at night in the desert retained in their memory the black silhouette of a tall, stout man against the red background of an enormous flattened disk. Night pursued them with her horrors, and so they did not learn of Lazarus's doings in the desert, but the vision of the black on red was forever branded on their brain. Just as a beast with a splinter in its eye furiously rubs its muzzle with its paws, so they too foolishly rubbed their eyes. But what Lazarus had given was indelible, and death alone could efface it. But there were people who lived far away, who never saw Lazarus and knew of him only by report. With daring curiosity which is stronger than fear and feeds upon it, with hidden mockery, they would come to Lazarus who was sitting in the sun and enter into conversation with him. By this time Lazarus' appearance had changed for the better and was not so terrible. The first minute they snapped their fingers and thought of how stupid the inhabitants of the holy city were. But when the short talk was over and they started homeward, their looks were such that the inhabitants of the holy city recognized them at once and said, "Look, there is one more fool on whom Lazarus has set his eye." And they shook their heads regretfully and lifted up their arms. There came brave, intrepid warriors with tinkling weapons. Happy youths came with laughter and song. Busy tradesmen, jingling their money, ran in for a moment, and haughty priests leaned their croziers against Lazarus's door. And they were all strangely changed as they came back. The same terrible shadow swooped down upon their souls and gave a new appearance to the old familiar world. Those who still had the desire to speak expressed their feelings thus: all things tangible and visible grew hollow, light and transparent, similar to lightsome shadows in the darkness of night. For that great darkness, which holds the whole cosmos, was dispersed neither by the sun or by the moon and the stars, but like an immense black shroud enveloped the earth, and like a mother embraced it. It penetrated all the bodies, iron and stone, and the particles of the bodies, having lost their ties, grew lonely, and it penetrated into the depths of the particles, and the particles of particles became lonely. For that great void which encircles the cosmos was not filled by things visible, neither by the sun nor by the moon and the stars, but reigned unrestrained, penetrating everywhere, severing body from body, particle from particle. In the void hollow trees spread hollow roots threatening a fantastic fall. Temples, palaces, and horses loomed up, and they were hollow. And in the void men moved about restlessly, but they were light and hollow, like shadows. For time was no more, and the beginning of all things came near their end. The building was still being built, and builders were still hammering away, and its ruins were already seen, and the void in its place. The man was still being born, but already funeral candles were burning at his head, and now they were extinguished, and there was the void in place of the man and of the funeral candles. And wrapped by void and darkness, the man in despair trembled in the face of the horror of the infinite. Thus spake the men who had still a desire to speak. But surely much more could have told those who wished not to speak, and died in silence. Part 4. At that time there lived in Rome a renowned sculptor. In clay, marble, and bronze he wrought bodies of gods and men, and such was their beauty that people called them immortal. But he himself was discontented, and asserted that there was something even more beautiful, that he could not embody either in marble or in bronze. "I have not yet gathered the glimmers of the moon, nor have I my fill of sunshine," he was wont to say, "and there is no soul in my marble, no life in my beautiful bronze." And when on moonlight nights he slowly walked along the road, crossing the black shadows of cypresses, his white tunic glittering in the moonshine, those who met him would laugh in a friendly way and say, "Art thou going to gather moonshine, Aurelius? Why then didst thou not fetch baskets?" And he would answer, laughing and pointing to his eyes, "Here are the baskets wherein I gather the sheen of the moon and the glimmer of the sun." And so it was. The moon glimmered in his eyes and the sun sparkled therein, but he could not translate them into marble, and therein lay the serene tragedy of his life. He was descended from an ancient patrician race, had a good wife and children, and suffered from no want.